Okay, so this is the Velleman MK183 SMD Christmas tree. Now let's have a look and see what is in the bag. Make sure you remove all parts from the bag. Next, organize all parts on a small plate. Carefully organize all parts by type. Make sure you don't lose any parts. Let's have a look at the parts that we have removed from their packaging. We have the battery holder, we have the diode that will act as a support, we have the USB connector, we have the switch, we have 3 transistors, a couple of resistors, 2 flavors, we have capacitors, and we have some very small LEDs. Let's take a closer look at our components. These are the LEDs. If you look closely, you will notice a green dot. The green dot should correspond with the white stripe on the PCB. Next to the LEDs we have the capacitors. The capacitors have a small white line. The white line on the capacitor should correspond with the plus sign on the PCB. Next to the capacitors we have 2 kinds of resistors. We have resistors that start with a 1 and we have resistors that start with a 4. This is very important. Next we have the transistors. This is the switch, the on-off switch. This is the USB connector. This is a small diode that will serve as a stand for the unit. And this finally is the battery holder. So we will start the assembly by applying a small layer of solder on one pad of each component. But before we start, let's clean our soldering iron. You can solder just any side of the part, it doesn't matter if it's left or right, but make sure you solder only one side of the part. A small amount of soldering is fine, don't overdo it. We will continue the assembly by placing the resistors with a 1. This is R1. R2, and finally R3, like this. Now we can solder the other side of the resistors. This will ensure a good electrical contact. Finally, we can put in place the remaining resistors. These are the ones that start with a 4. Now that we've gained some practice with the resistors, we can start and try to solder the LEDs. As we've mentioned before, the LEDs have a green dot, and the green dot should correspond with the white line on the PCB. Be very careful with the LEDs because they are very small and very sensitive. And make sure to pay attention to the correct position of the green dot. If you turn them around, they will not work. It's very difficult to remove them from the PCB. This is our final LED, and we can start soldering the other side of the LED. Try soldering quickly to avoid overheating the LEDs, as they are very sensitive to overheating. Let's continue with our transistors. The transistors are very small and they have 3 legs. Carefully position them and solder the upper leg. Check the position again. If necessary, you can reheat and carefully move it a little bit. Now we will solder the remaining legs of the transistors. Next we will put in place the capacitors. Be very careful, capacitors have a polarity, so the thick white line on the capacitor must correspond with a plus sign on the PCB. If necessary, you can just easily turn them around and resolder one side. Capacitors are quite easy to solder, as they are almost the biggest parts that are supplied with this. So far for the assembly of the SMD parts of this kit. Now we move on to the through-hole components, and we start with the slide switch. The slide switch is going to be mounted at the bottom, like this, and we will solder it at the solder side of the PCB. Make sure it is straight, and then we can solder the remaining legs of the slide switch. We continue with the USB connector. The USB connector will make sure that we can also power our little tree from a PC instead of a battery. We put it in place like this, and we carefully solder the legs so that it stays in place. Turn it around a little bit, and then we can solder the remaining parts like this. And now we go for the tricky part, because we need to solder both these connections and the one to the right. So carefully apply solder without heating too long, so that we avoid to damage the connector. The small diode will serve as a stand for the Christmas tree, so we will bend it a little bit like this, and then we carefully position it into the 2 holes like this. Now we can apply some solder to keep it in place. The diode is not actually used as a component, it's just a stand, so the direction of the diode is not important in this case. And finally we can put in place the battery holder. As this is a completely metal part, it requires a little bit longer heating before your solder will properly melt. Now is a very exciting time of the day when you finally insert the battery. Be careful, the plus goes in like this. Gently slide it all the way in. Now if you flip the switch, there you go, the Christmas tree lights.